The office of Speaker of the House is a peculiarly American institution, one that doesn't really have a direct analog anywhere else in the world. A lot of people, when they first hear the presidential order of succession, they find it strange that the House Speaker is right at the top of the list after the President and the Vice President, since here in the 21st century, the Speaker often isn't one of the most prominent players on the stage of national politics. But when you think about how our government was conceived by the men who conceived it, it makes total sense why the occupant of that office should be that high up on that list. In fact, you can learn a lot about the original conception of our national government by looking at the presidential succession list. The Speaker of the House comes directly after the Vice President because he, or she, is the head of the House of the People's Representatives. Remember, the Senate isn't popularly elected and doesn't become popularly elected until we get to the horrendous, god-awful, terrible, horrid 17th Amendment a little over 100 years ago. So as an administrative matter, your three main organs of government are the executive branch, represented by the president, and the two houses of the legislative branch, one of which contains the people's elected representatives, and the other of which, the Senate, contains the designated representatives of the state governments as elected by their legislatures. And so the president pro tempore of the Senate is next on the succession list after the Speaker of the House, because that's the order of precedence that the founders settled on. The presidency will devolve first onto the designated heir from within the executive branch, who's also president of the Senate, then to the chief of the people's representatives, then to the chief of the state's representatives. And obviously, since the vice president is also president of the Senate, that's why you have to also have a president pro tempore. Otherwise, you've got the same guy or woman in the number 1 and the number 3 spots on the succession list, and you can't have that. Up until the first half of the 20th century, it would have made perfect sense to every American that the House Speaker and the President pro tempore of the Senate should be the top figures on the succession list, because up until then, so far as the domestic political landscape goes, the President and the House and the Senate were seen as roughly co-equal figures with similar levels of power over the course of events, as they were supposed to be. But for the last 90 years now, since the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, domestic political power has been draining away from the legislative branch and toward the executive branch, to the point where now, when the president thinks a thing should be done and Congress doesn't want to do the thing, he just tells them to fuck off and does it anyway by executive order. And that's the sort of thing that would have been inconceivable up until fairly recently, because that's not how our form of government was set up. It was set up with guardrails and checks and balances. But guardrails and checks and balances don't work all that well unless the people who are supposed to be abiding by them actually do that. But our presidents have failed in this department, and both houses of Congress and the judiciary have done not nearly enough to forestall it. But I digress. The office of House Speaker is probably as close as our form of government gets to the British parliamentary model, since it's an example where a member of the legislative branch also wields some form of executive power. Indeed, in some cases, absolute autocratic power, because one of the most bizarre features of our government, at least, again, from our perspective here in the 21st century, is that the House Speaker is, to all intents and purposes, the monarch of the capital city. Don't be fooled by the fact that there's a person called Mayor of Washington, D.C., and a group of people called the Washington, D.C. City Council, because that mayor and that council, they wield no power except that which the Speaker of the House chooses to delegate to them. A delegation that the Speaker can revoke at any time of his or her choosing. Which is to say, there is a new absolute autocratic ruler of Washington, D.C. today, whom we can now officially address as Speaker Mike Johnson, currently in his 4th term from the 4th District of Louisiana. Most people hadn't heard of Mike Johnson until yesterday, at least not this particular Mike Johnson, because let's face it, everybody in America probably knows a guy named Mike Johnson. It's probably the most blandly American name there is, and that's just fine. But if you're a regular viewer of this program, you already know this man's name, because I called attention to what I thought was his very fine performance against Homeland Security Secretary, enemy saboteur, and skin-suited reptilian space alien Alejandro Mayorkas in a committee hearing earlier this year, a clip that has now gone viral, and for pretty good reason. Mike Johnson is clearly a very sharp guy, a very well-spoken guy, a guy who's willing to publicly call out a scumbag criminal who is smugly lying right to his face. And I hope he keeps that up in his new role, because let's face it, he's going to sink or swim just like all Republican House speakers do, according to how effectively he deals with an openly, venomously hostile fake news media that advocates for the other party and doesn't pretend otherwise. Kevin McCarthy, I thought, did unexpectedly well at that aspect of the job. He didn't suffer very many foolish bullshit questions. He would tell a reporter exactly why their premise was complete nonsense. And this whole thing worked out pretty surprisingly well for Matt Gaetz, who he decided to push all his chips to the middle of the table and put his political future pretty much on the line to oust McCarthy and hope that somehow, some way, when the music stopped, they'd wind up with somebody who was an upgrade. And it looks like that's exactly what happened. Jim Jordan didn't make it. He would have been an upgrade too, obviously. I'm not heartbroken that he didn't get it, because I think he's doing great work in his committees, and becoming the speaker might have only blunted his effectiveness. But it looks like this thing came down, as these things often do, to a personality contest, because even the squishy liberal Republicans voted for Mike Johnson, who is, by pretty much any standard, more conservative than Jim Jordan is. So obviously there's no objective political standard at work here. It may just be, it probably is, that Jordan just has enemies in the conference and Johnson doesn't. But in any event, our short national nightmare is over. The People's House is back open for business, and they can get back down to the very important work of spending your money like drunken sailors on a 48-hour shore leave. Oh, and you'll be shocked to learn that the Democrats and the fake news media, but I repeat myself, say that Mike Johnson is a dangerous, radical, right-wing, MAGA, extremist, insurrectionist, election denier who wants to unplug your grandma's life support and make your daughter get a back alley abortion. No, of course we didn't write these monologues 2 weeks ago, and we just been waiting around to see whose name we need to copy-paste in there. We'd never do something like that. We are intrepid professional journalists around here. How dare you?